Why did Japan surrender in World War II? The answer, as many believe, is not as simple as the atomic bombs or the Soviet invasion. To understand this monumental question, we must journey into the heart of Japan's political and spiritual identity. A story driven by a single man, Emperor Hirohito. Upon his ascension in 1926, Hirohito inherited not a peaceful empire, but a nation grappling with a significant financial crisis. More critically, he inherited a military that was increasingly seizing control of governmental policies, operating with a degree of insubordination that tested the very foundations of imperial authority. From the outset, and contrary to the popular narrative, Hirohito was a keen and intense observer of all military decisions, meticulously following their every move. He was not a passive figurehead, but an active participant, carefully choosing when to assert his divine power and when to allow the military to have its way. This dynamic was first put on public display with the Kwantung Army's audacious actions in China. When they assassinated the Chinese warlord Zhang Zuolin without imperial consent, Hirohito chose to indulge their insubordination. This leniency, a conscious choice by the emperor, emboldened the rogue elements and led them to a fateful next step. It gave them the confidence to stage a false flag operation in Manchuria in 1931, leading to a full-scale invasion of the region. Hirohito, though reportedly furious, was not angry at the territorial gain itself, but at the unauthorized and hasty nature of the operation. While some attempts were made to control the army, they were heavily undermined by radicals. The emperor, who could have easily put his foot down and punished the insubordination, chose not to. In a pivotal moment on September 22, 1931, at 4:20 p.m., he told the Imperial Japanese Army Chief of the General Staff, Kanin Kotohito, although this time it couldn't be helped. The army had to be more careful in the future. This was a telling mix of rebuke and acceptance. The military had disregarded his direct wishes and should have been severely punished, but he simply slapped them on the wrist. This raises a crucial question that lies at the core of our story. Why did Hirohito not take a firmer stance? For decades, a powerful and enduring myth persisted, particularly among older generations, that Hirohito was a helpless victim of circumstance, a hostage emperor. This narrative gained traction after Japan's surrender, because the United States, in its effort to maintain political control and stability, deliberately rewrote the Japanese constitution and covered up the emperor's direct involvement in the war. The truth, as revealed by meeting notes and personal accounts, particularly from his closest aide, Kido Koichi, released after Hirohito's death in 1989, is that he was an instrumental figure in many military decisions from 1931 to 1945. So, if he was not a powerless figure, what was the invisible force guiding his decisions? To truly understand Hirohito's subtle, often contradictory actions, one must grasp a concept that is both central to Japanese identity and remarkably vague: the Kokutai. This term, which loosely translates to national essence, refers to the immutable qualities that distinguish the Japanese identity. It is an abstract, eternal, and immutable aspect of the state, rooted in history, tradition, and customs, and it is inextricably linked to the divine authority of the emperor. In stark contrast is the seitei, or form of government, which evolved over time. While shoguns governed for over 700 years, until the 1868 Meiji Restoration, the emperor's direct rule was reinstated. However, even this direct rule was an illusion. The 1889 Meiji Constitution established a constitutional monarchy, introducing a complex and intentionally ambiguous system of governance. For example, Article 4 of the Constitution declared, "The emperor is the head of the empire, combining in himself the rights of sovereignty uniting the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government, although subject to the consent of the imperial diet. This framework was riddled with a glaring flaw. A democratic parliament existed alongside an emperor with absolute authority. Most critically, the military, the army and the navy, were not directly accountable to the civilian government. They answered solely to the emperor. This ambiguity was a political golden ticket for Hirohito. It defended the Kokutai, reinforced his authority as a divine ruler, and, most importantly, allowed him to wield immense power without being personally blamed for the consequences. If anything went wrong, he could simply lay the blame at the feet of the military. Hirohito's upbringing was designed to prepare him for this complex role. At the age of 3, according to imperial custom, he was placed in the care of the Kawamura family, who vowed to raise him to be unselfish, persevering in the face of difficulties, respectful of the views of others, and immune to fear. Above all, he was indoctrinated with the mission to defend the Kokutai. It was the very core of his worldview. For Hirohito, the insubordinate acts of the military in the 1930s were not a fundamental threat to his power, but a threat to the Kokutai itself. While the military had usurped his authority in their operations, those operations had been successful and brought about the expansion of the empire, a goal Hirohito was fully on board with. He understood the value of Manchuria and was on board with the military's plans to eventually seize control of it. A plan that had been in the works since before the Russo-Japanese War. The problem, as he saw it, was that radicals were accelerating things far too quickly. He turned a blind eye, dished out light punishments, and carried on, believing that a little insubordination was a small price to pay for the preservation of his authority. This delicate balance of power, however, was about to be shattered by an escalating internal conflict. The local conflict, however, escalated. By 1932, it had traveled to Shanghai, a city filled with Western powers. Hirohito understood that this could provoke economic sanctions from nations like Britain and America. He finally took action, ordering General Yoshinori Shirakawa to bring the Shanghai expedition to a close. This period also saw the emergence of two key factions within the Japanese military, engaged in a fierce power struggle: the radical Kodoha, Imperial Way, and the more moderate Toseiha, Control, faction. The Kodoha, founded by General Sadao Araki and his protege Jinzaburo Masaki, was primarily composed of young army officers who espoused a romanticized and often radical interpretation of Bushido. Their objective was a Showa restoration aimed at purging Japan of corrupt politicians and businessmen associated with the powerful Zaibatsu corporations. They believed that Western influence had tainted the nation and sought to return to a pre-industrial ideal. To achieve their goals, they resorted to assassinations and planned a coup d'etat. In response, the Toseiha faction was formed, led by figures like Lieutenant General Tetsuzan Nagata, and later by Hideki Tojo. They too sought a Showa restoration, but adopted a more conservative and pragmatic approach. They recognized the importance of preserving traditional values while integrating Western ideals. They promoted military strategies for modern warfare and preferred to work within the existing political system, believing that future total wars would necessitate a strengthened industrial military capacity. The most significant distinction was that the Toseiha explicitly rejected the use of a coup d'etat. Between 1932 and 1936, radical Kodoha officers assassinated numerous politicians and military leaders. While one might be led to believe this was in Hirohito's interest, that would be a mistake. Hirohito absolutely did not want a military dictatorship. He wanted to maintain the exact ambiguous situation that existed, which was working to his benefit. It defended the Kokutai, and he could not be personally blamed for everything that was going on. It was an ideal situation for him. He was making most of the decisions, but the responsibility was being placed on the shoulders of his military. The climax of the Kotoha's efforts was the February 26th incident of 1936, a mutiny in which they believed the emperor would simply join them and take direct rule. They were gravely mistaken. Hirohito was incensed. His first thought was that the mutineers were trying to enlist his brother, Prince Chichibu, to overthrow him. He demanded that his brother stop associating with the radicals and promised never to challenge him. He then furiously demanded that the mutineers be dealt with, even threatening to lead the imperial guards personally to put them down. The coup failed, and the Tosei-ha, who were instrumental in putting it down, became the de facto ruling clique. The military, especially the Kwantung Army, did not stop its insubordination. After invading Manchuria, they set their sights on North China and Inner Mongolia. On July 8, 1937, they performed another false flag operation, this time at the Marco Polo Bridge, which officially ushered in the Second Sino-Japanese War. When told of this, Hirohito's first concern was whether the USSR would invade Manchuria. He demanded to know what contingency plans existed, stating to his ministers that their initial responses were no more than army dogma. After countless advisors explained their options, he finally gave the red seal of approval to invade northern China. From that point on, he micromanaged military decisions, overseeing the formation and dissolution of numerous cabinets. He was presented with several opportunities to seek peace during the war, particularly after the attack on Nanjing, but he remained focused on victory. This unwavering focus on victory would soon lead to a confrontation with global powers. By 1939, the United States began threatening sanctions against Japan for its actions in China. Hirohito complained to his chief aide, "It could be a great blow to scrap metal and oil." He was livid and scolded his top officials, forcing the appointment of General Abe Nobuyuki to prime minister and demanding that he cooperate with the US and Britain. As war raged in Europe, Hirohito asked his chief of staff on June 19, 1940, about deploying troops to the Netherlands, East Indies, and French Indochina, believing that Germany's imminent victory would prevent those nations from defending their vital resources. The military soon concluded that an invasion of Hong Kong might be necessary to cut off supply lines to China, which would mean declaring war on Britain. When this was explained to him, Hirohito responded, "If that occurs, I'm sure America will enforce an embargo." Don't you think so? He knew the consequences, but eventually signed Imperial Order No. 458, authorizing the invasion of French Indochina. The United States, United Kingdom, and the Netherlands all began embargoes on oil, rubber, and iron, all things needed for the military. As Admiral Takagi put it, Japan would either be totally defeated or forced to fight a hopeless war. A choice that would define the rest of the war. Hirohito fully understood this predicament. With each passing day, Japan's oil reserves dwindled. On October 13th, he told his closest advisor, Kido Koichi, "In the present situation, there seems to be little hope for Japan-US negotiations. If hostilities erupt this time, I think I may have to issue a declaration of war." After war broke out with the West, Hirohito had the ability to stamp his foot down, though there was a risk his military might usurp him. His actions were always guided by the protection of the Kokutai. From the outset, he believed Germany would defeat the USSR, and in line with his military leaders, he believed Japan had to seize as much as possible in the Asia-Pacific and hold off the United States until a negotiated peace could be met. Hirohito committed himself to overseeing the war, determined to achieve victory at all costs. He was a very cautious leader, meticulously analyzing each campaign and crafting worst-case scenarios. He maintained a skeptical view of reports from his senior officials and was harshly critical of high commanders. While he did not frequently visit the front lines, Hirohito wielded significant influence over theater operations, shaping both planning and execution whenever he deemed it necessary. He issued the highest military orders from the imperial headquarters, where he conducted conferences and made decisions communicated under his official name. He regularly welcomed generals and admirals to the imperial palace for detailed briefings and visited various military bases, adding to his comprehensive involvement in the war effort. The war went extremely well for Japan until the Battle of Midway and Guadalcanal. Midway was a major setback, but Japan retained the initiative. Then, the Guadalcanal campaign saw Japan lose that initiative to the Americans. Upon receiving the initial report of the Ichigi detachment's annihilation, Hirohito remarked, "I am sure Guadalcanal can be held." Despite numerous reports detailing the devastating effects of tropical diseases and starvation upon his troops, he persistently demanded greater efforts. He exerted continuous pressure on his naval and land commanders to retake the island, requesting additional Imperial Japanese Army troops and aircraft be allocated to the cause on September 15th, November 5th, and November 11th. Undeterred by objections from his senior commanders, he persisted. By late November, it was evident Guadalcanal was a lost cause. Yet at a conference on December 31st, 1942, Hirohito sanctioned the decision to cancel attempts to recapture the island but stated, "It is unacceptable to just give up on capturing Guadalcanal. We must launch an offensive elsewhere." He even threatened to withhold authorization for withdrawing troops until a new plan was established, later opposing the withdrawal from Munda Airfield as it contradicted a newly defined defensive line. His phrase, "Do this for me so I can have peace of mind for a while," became a kind of signature. After Guadalcanal, it was loss after loss for Japan. By February 1944, Hirohito forced General Sugiyama Hajime to resign, so Hideki Tojo could take his position, even though Tojo was already Prime Minister and Army Minister. Hirohito worked closely with Tojo to plan last-ditch efforts to change the war situation, the most significant being Operation Ichigo. While it inflicted much damage on China, it did not deliver the knockout blow. As island after island fell to the Americans, Hirohito warned Tojo about Saipan. "If we ever lose Saipan, repeated air attacks on Tokyo will follow. No matter what it takes, we must hold there." When Saipan fell, Hirohito stopped supporting Tojo and allowed his rivals to take down his cabinet by June 18, 1944. Hirohito remained resolute. On October 18th, the imperial headquarters ordered a decisive naval engagement, which led directly to the Battle of Leyte Gulf. After the war, Hirohito publicly stated, "I consented to the showdown battle at Leyte, believing that if we launched an attack and the Americans hesitated, we might finally find an opportunity to negotiate." When Leyte Gulf failed, the military began the kamikaze programs. On New Year's Day 1945, Hirohito was involved in inspecting the special last meal rations given to departing kamikaze units. Iwo Jima fell. Hirohito lashed out. "Is it because we failed to sink enemy transports? That we've let the enemy get ashore? Isn't there any way to defend Okinawa from the landing enemy forces?" He kept pushing and pushing for more to be done, leading to a horrible failure that cost the lives of up to 120,000 Japanese combatants and 170,000 non-combatants. It was a bloodbath, the worst battle of the Pacific War. With this defeat, a new kind of terror began to grip the imperial court. Around this period, Japan began seriously looking for ways to surrender. Their forces in Burma had been annihilated, and in China, despite some gains from Operation Ichigo, they faced a costly guerrilla war. They deeply feared that once the Soviets finished with Germany, they would turn on Japan and invade Manchuria from the north, while the United States would invade from the south. By 1945, 43% of the Imperial Japanese Army was stationed in the home islands, bracing for the final stand. In May 1945, Former Prime Minister Wakatsuki Reijiro came out of retirement to urge Hirohito and Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki to open negotiations. However, he also stated, the enemy must first be made to see the disadvantages of continuing the war. Hirohito's chief counselor, Makino Nobuaki, agreed that the ultimate priority was to develop an advantageous war situation. Other advisors, like Admiral Okada Keisuke, said, Japan should wait for a moment favorable for us, then make peace, while others, like Keiichiro Hiranuma, advised fighting to the death. A key player in the surrender decision was Prince Konoe Fumimaro, who was very close to Hirohito and understood the emperor's mentality in relation to the Kokutai. For over 18 months, Konoe had been warning Hirohito that continuing the war would threaten the Kokutai from within. He confided in the emperor's brother, Prince Takamatsu, that the army was suffering from a cancer in the form of the Tosei-ha faction, which, while previously seen as a stabilizing force, was now the greater threat to the Kokutai. In a written report to the emperor on February 14th, Konoe warned that if the conflict persisted, a far greater fear than defeat by the Anglo-American enemy was the potential destruction of the Kokutai from domestic forces. He speculated that a communist revolution, facilitated by the very generals the emperor trusted, was a real and present danger. Konoe implored for a swift peace settlement to preserve the Kokutai before a revolution emerged. Hirohito agreed with Konoe's analysis, but stated that ending the war would be difficult unless they achieved one more military gain. Konoe allegedly replied, "Is that possible? It must happen soon. If we have to wait much longer, a mere battle victory will mean nothing." The emperor replied, "If we hold out long enough in this war, we may be able to win, but what worries me is whether the nation will be able to endure it until then." On February 15th, Hirohito's intelligence warned that the Soviet Union would likely abrogate its neutrality pact with Japan. Even Tojo conceded there was a 50-50 chance the USSR would invade Manchuria. In March, B-29 incendiary bombing raids over Tokyo turned 40% of the capital into ash. On March 18th, Hirohito personally drove around the capital to witness the devastation. He was told that factory production was collapsing, absenteeism was rising, and instances of lèse-majesté were running rampant. It was only after the Battle of Okinawa was lost and 60 Japanese cities had been leveled that Hirohito openly indicated he wanted to negotiate a surrender. Hito's diary reveals the first clear indication on June 8th, when he drafted his plan for controlling the crisis situation. This plan proposed seeking the Soviet Union's assistance as an intermediary to help Japan gain leverage in negotiations. By drafting this plan, Hito signaled the end of his alliance with military hardliners, and Hirohito's acceptance indicated his readiness for peace. However, Hirohito and the Suzuki government had no concrete plans on how to mediate a surrender through the Soviets. Their primary concern was a guarantee of the emperor's political position and the retainment of the imperial system, the Kokutai, rather than ending the war as quickly as possible. The Americans, meanwhile, at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, had made it known they would only accept unconditional surrender. By 1945, they understood this left Japan in a predicament. The Potsdam Declaration, issued on July 26, 1945, came in the form of an ultimatum. It called for the unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces, stating that the alternative was prompt and utter destruction. There was no mention of the emperor. The status of the Kokutai was thus up in the air. The next day, the Suzuki cabinet rejected the terms, still banking on Soviet mediation. Then came the final, devastating blows. On August 6th, the United States dropped the Little Boy atomic bomb on Hiroshima, instantly killing an estimated 100,000 people. 2 days later, The Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. Then, on August 9th, a second atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki. In the midst of this, Hirohito remained silent about accepting the Potsdam terms. His primary concern was the imperial regalia, which symbolized his divine rule, and he insisted on having them brought to the palace. This fixation on his symbols of office occurred during the most pivotal moment of the war, as he was unprepared to seize the opportunity to end the war himself. The psychological shocks of the first atomic bomb and the Soviet entry into the war, combined with the emperor's and Kido's concerns over escalating public criticism of the throne, fueled a near-paranoid fear that the populace would react violently if the war persisted. Home Ministry reports from governors and police chiefs had indicated that citizens were beginning to label the emperor as an incompetent leader responsible for the deteriorating war situation. This was the third variable, rarely discussed, that terrified Hirohito and his closest advisors. One cannot have the Kokutai without the populace to hold it up. The atomic bombs and the Soviet invasion escalated the pain to unimaginable levels, intensifying the threat from within and giving Hirohito the perfect golden get-out-of-jail-free card to surrender and protect his throne. At the first meeting of the six-member Supreme War Leadership Council on August 9th, the conversation revolved around whether to insist on one condition, the preservation of the Kokutai, or all four, which included the military assuming responsibility for disarmament, a prohibition on occupation, and the delegation of war criminal trials to the Japanese government. The debate represented conflicting visions for the future of the state and masked the competition for political power. It is doubtful whether the emperor initially sided with the single-condition advocates, as a more likely inference is that he retained sympathies for the hardliners who preferred to continue the futile war rather than surrender. Ultimately, the Japanese and moderates found it easier to capitulate to external pressures than to take decisive action on their own. As Admiral Yonai Mitsumasa said to Admiral Takagi Sokichi on August 12th, the atomic bombs and the Soviet entry were, in a sense, gifts from the gods. This way we don't have to say that we quit the war because of domestic circumstances. The elites found it fortunate that they could now control matters without revealing the collapsing domestic situation. On the night of August 14th, the Suzuki government notified the Allies that it had accepted the Potsdam Declaration and the subsequent Burns Letter, which essentially guaranteed the emperor's non-military role. Accelerating this was the American psychological warfare campaign, with leaflets dropped from B-29s informing the Japanese people of their government's surrender notification and the terms of the Allied response. The leaflets undermined the government's reliance on secrecy and prompted immediate action from the court. At noon on August 15th, the Japanese people heard, for the first time, the high-pitched voice of their emperor broadcast over the radio. In his address, he cited the new and most cruel bomb and the risk of the total extinction of human civilization as the reasons for his decision. He framed the surrender as a benevolent act to save his people, allowing him to deflect responsibility for leading them into misery and to strengthen domestic unity around himself, thereby protecting the Kokutai. This declaration to the civilian population was not the same one sent to the military. On August 17th, he issued a second rescript to the soldiers and sailors, specifying Soviet participation as the sole reason for surrender while maintaining the Kokutai as the primary aim. This dissembling until the very end, and even beyond, illustrated that the emperor presented two completely different justifications for his delayed surrender. Months later, Hirohito said of his decision, "The main motive behind my decision at that time was that if we did not act, the Japanese race would perish, and I would be unable to protect my loyal subjects. If the enemy landed near bay, both at shrines would immediately come under their control. There would be no time to transfer the sacred treasures, the regalia of the imperial family, and no hope of protecting them. Under these circumstances, protection of the Kokutai would be difficult. For these reasons, I thought at that time that I must make peace, even at the sacrifice of myself. The childish argument over whether Japan surrendered because of the atomic bombs or the Soviet invasion misses the crucial multivariable answer. The evidence suggests that the first atomic bomb and the Soviet declaration of war led Hirohito and the other members of the court to believe that continuing the war would inevitably result in the destruction of the Kokutai from within. The populace was war-weary and despondent, and with rising hostility toward the military and government, a social revolution was a real possibility. When the emperor expressed in February, "What worries me is whether the nation will be able to endure it until then," he feared not just the suffering of his subjects, but that such suffering would lead to social upheaval. The atomic bombs and the Soviet invasion escalated the pain to unimaginable levels, intensifying the threat from within and giving Hirohito the perfect golden get-out-of-jail-free card to surrender and protect his throne. On August 12th, when his uncle, Prince Yasuhiko Asaka, asked if the war would be continued if the Kokutai could not be preserved, Hirohito replied, "Of course." This final statement reveals that the preservation of the Kokutai was always, above all else, his #1 priority. And so, we come to the close of this extraordinary chapter in world history. We have seen how a complex web of events, internal power struggles, and ancient ideology converged to shape the final moments of a brutal war. By bringing this history to life through animation, we hope to make these pivotal moments more accessible and engaging for everyone. This content is a culmination of research from respected historians, with references appearing on screen for your own exploration. If you found this journey into the mind of Emperor Hirohito as captivating as we did, please be sure to subscribe, like, comment, and share this video with others who love history. Your support allows us to continue making history both informative and entertaining. We have many more stories to tell, so stay tuned for our upcoming videos.